The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and cold air conditioning, the kind that made your skin tighten without you realizing it. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people settled in. Papers shuffled. Someone coughed. I stood there with my hands folded in front of me, eyes forward, breathing slow, as if this were any other room and not the place where my life was about to be dissected in public. My husband leaned in close enough that I felt the warmth of his breath brush my ear. His voice was low, confident, almost bored. "She's weak." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. From the corner of my eye, I saw his mistress smile. Not a wide smile, not cruel, just certain. The kind of smile someone wears when they believe the outcome has already been decided. Behind them, his family sat in a neat row. No one met my gaze. One of them nodded slightly, as if agreeing with a statement of fact. Another pretended to study the floor. Their silence wasn't neutral. It was alignment. They waited for me to react, to flinch, to say something I shouldn't, to cry. I did none of it. I stayed still. I kept my face empty. I let the quiet stretch. They mistook that quiet for fear, the way people always do when they don't understand what restraint looks like. At the bench, the judge opened the file. Thick, heavy. The sound of paper echoed louder than it should have. He didn't speak. He read. His expression didn't change. Seconds passed. Then more. The room grew tense in that subtle way people only notice once it's already too late. They thought this silence belonged to me. They had no idea it belonged to him. I had been called many things in the months leading up to that hearing. Emotional, passive, unprepared, too trusting, too soft to understand what was happening around me. The story they told about me was neat and convenient, the kind of story that makes other people comfortable because it explains everything without asking hard questions. Even standing there, with my future balanced on a legal technicality, they believed the same thing. That I had shown up outmatched. That I had nothing left except dignity, and that dignity would crumble once the pressure set in. I felt none of that. What I felt was calm. Not the calm of denial, but the calm that comes when there are no more decisions left to make. I had already made them. Weeks ago, quietly, patiently, while they were busy congratulating themselves. The judge turned a page. My husband shifted in his seat, relaxed, crossing his ankle over his knee. His confidence filled the room. It always had. It was one of the things people admired about him, mistook for competence, for leadership. He had built his life on the assumption that certainty was the same as control. His mistress leaned back slightly, hands folded on her lap, eyes forward now. She wasn't watching me anymore. She was watching the judge, waiting for the words that would end this quickly so they could move on to whatever came next. Renovations, trips, a future that didn't include me. I stood alone at my table, my attorney beside me, but emotionally untouched by the noise around us. I wasn't bracing myself for impact. I wasn't rehearsing what I would say if things went badly. I was waiting, because weakness had never been my problem. Silence had simply been more useful. The bailiff cleared his throat. The judge closed the file, fingers resting on the cover for a moment longer than necessary. The room held its breath. Somewhere behind me, someone exhaled too loudly. I kept my eyes on the bench. That moment, suspended and fragile, was where everything they believed about me began to unravel. Long before I ever set foot in that courtroom, I had learned how easy it was for people to underestimate what they didn't bother to understand. I had learned how quickly confidence could turn into carelessness. I had learned that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one holding the most power. They believed I had arrived there with nothing because they had never bothered to check what I carried quietly. The judge adjusted the papers, his pen resting between his fingers. He glanced up, not at my husband, not at his attorney, not at the woman sitting beside him, but at me. Just once, brief, assessing. That look told me everything I needed to know. I did not straighten my posture or lift my chin. I did not give him anything extra to read into. I remained exactly as they had labeled me. Still, calm, unassuming. They thought they had reduced me to this moment. They didn't realize I had chosen it. When the judge finally opened his mouth, it would not be to confirm their version of the story. It would be to correct it. And once spoken aloud, that correction could never be taken back. I had been patient. I had been quiet. I had been dismissed. And that, as it turned out, was the most dangerous position in the room. The sound of a pen clicking somewhere in the courtroom pulled me backward, away from the bench, and into a memory I hadn't visited in a long time. For a split second, the polished wood and stiff air dissolved, replaced by sunlight, laughter, and a version of myself who still believed certainty was something you earned by loving hard enough. I met Andrew in a place where I already belonged. That detail matters more than I realized at the time. I wasn't lost. I wasn't looking to be rescued. I had my own apartment, my own routine, my own work that paid my bills and gave me pride. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, solid and self-directed. He noticed me because I wasn't trying to be noticed. He said that later like it was a compliment. At first it felt flattering. He was confident in the way people admire, the kind of man who spoke as if his thoughts arrived fully formed and worth listening to. He asked questions, but only enough to keep the conversation moving back to where he wanted it. I remember thinking how refreshing it was that he didn't seem intimidated. He liked that I had opinions, that I could hold my own. Or at least he liked saying he did. Our early relationship moved quickly, not recklessly, but with a sense of inevitability that made hesitation feel unnecessary. We talked about values, about ambition, about wanting a life that felt intentional. I believed we were building something parallel, two paths choosing to run side by side. There were moments even then that should have slowed me down, little things I brushed aside because they didn't fit the story I wanted to believe. When I questioned a plan, he would smile and say I was overthinking. When I pushed back gently, he would reassure me that he appreciated my concern, but that he had already thought it through. It never sounded dismissive. That was the trick. It sounded protective. When he introduced me to his family, I felt the shift before I could name it. They were polite, observant, measuring. Conversations flowed around me more than to me. Decisions were discussed as if they already existed by the time I arrived in the room. They praised me often, but always in the same way. You're so easy to be around. You don't make things complicated. You're very understanding. Each comment landed softly, wrapped in approval. I accepted them as compliments because that's how they were offered. I didn't realize they were also instructions. Andrew noticed how well I fit. He told me how much his family liked that I didn't challenge him, didn't embarrass him, didn't push. I told myself that compromise was part of partnership, that not every hill was worth dying on. Peace felt productive. Harmony felt mature. When we decided to get married, it felt like the natural next step, not a leap. There was no dramatic proposal, no grand gesture. Just a quiet agreement that this was where we were headed. I trusted him. I trusted the version of us I thought we were. The early months of marriage were calm, efficient. We divided responsibilities in a way that seemed logical. He handled the things he said were complex. I handled the rest. Paperwork came and went. Forms were signed. Decisions were made. I noticed how often he said, "I'll take care of it." At first it felt like relief. There was a moment I remember with uncomfortable clarity now. We were sitting at the table, documents spread between us. I skimmed the first page, asked a question about language I didn't like, something that felt too open-ended. He laughed softly and told me it was standard, that everyone did it this way, that it would only slow things down to get into details that didn't matter. He slid the pen toward me. I hesitated, just for a second. Then I signed. Looking back, I can pinpoint that as the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to set a precedent. Trust over verification, efficiency over clarity, silence rewarded with approval. From that point on, it became easier for them to speak for me. Andrew would answer questions directed at both of us. His family would reference decisions I hadn't realized were finalized. When I expressed surprise, it was met with confusion, as if I had missed a memo rather than been excluded. "You didn't seem like you'd mind," Andrew would say. And I didn't. Not outwardly. I smiled. I adjusted. I told myself this was what compromise looked like in a grown marriage. That strong women didn't need to fight every battle to prove they were strong. Over time, the image of me solidified in their minds. The agreeable one. The calm one. The woman who didn't make scenes or ask uncomfortable questions. It became a role I stepped into without realizing I had stopped choosing it. I thought kindness was a form of strength. I thought patience was a virtue. I didn't understand how easily both could be rebranded as weakness by people who benefited from my restraint. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving me standing in the courtroom again, the judge still silent, the air heavy with expectation. That version of me had believed that trust was mutual, that partnership meant shared power. She had no idea how carefully that belief would be used against her. The story they were telling now, about who I was and what I deserved, didn't start with betrayal. It started with praise. And it ended here. Marriage didn't change everything overnight. That's another reason it took me so long to see what was happening. The shift came quietly, disguised as normal progress, the kind of changes people praise as signs of stability and growth. We settled into routines that looked healthy from the outside. Mornings were efficient, evenings were planned. Conversations revolved around goals, timelines, and what made the most sense for the future. Andrew spoke in plurals a lot back then. We decided, we agreed. It created the impression of balance, even when the decisions themselves were no longer shared equally. I contributed in ways that didn't come with titles. I organized, smoothed transitions, anticipated problems before they surfaced. I offered perspective when Andrew needed to present ideas or negotiate outcomes. He accepted that help easily, even eagerly, as long as it didn't require acknowledging where it came from. Gradually, he positioned himself as the one who handled what he called the complicated parts. Finances, long-term planning, legal details. He framed it as practicality, not authority. I told myself it was efficient, that dividing responsibilities didn't mean surrendering control. The first major decision that truly mattered arrived wrapped in opportunity. Andrew brought it home like good news, his energy sharp, confident. There was urgency in the way he spoke, a sense that hesitation would be a mistake we'd regret later. He explained the upside clearly. The risks were mentioned, but lightly, like footnotes that didn't deserve attention. I asked questions, real ones, about timelines, about ownership, about what protections existed if things didn't unfold the way he expected. Andrew listened, nodded, then reassured me with practiced ease. He told me I was right to be cautious, that he admired how thoughtful I was, but that this was one of those moments where moving quickly mattered more than overanalyzing. He said he had already spoken to people who knew more than either of us. He said it was standard. He said this was how things worked when you wanted to build something real. I felt that familiar flicker of unease, the one I had learned to dismiss. I didn't want to be the person who slowed progress with doubt. I didn't want to turn a shared future into a negotiation. So I agreed. The paperwork came shortly after, thick, formal, filled with language designed to sound reassuring while saying very little plainly. We sat at the dining table, the same place where we planned holidays and talked about our lives. Andrew flipped through pages with practiced speed, summarizing sections, skipping others. I remember tracing the margins with my finger, pausing over phrasing that felt intentionally vague. When I asked about it, Andrew smiled and told me it was boilerplate, that everyone signed documents like this, that reading too closely only created unnecessary anxiety. He slid the pen across the table again. This time I hesitated longer. Long enough to notice how quiet the room had become. Long enough to feel the weight of the decision settling into my chest. I thought about trust, about partnership, about how marriage wasn't supposed to feel like a transaction. Then I signed. That signature didn't take anything from me immediately. That's the part no one warns you about. There was no dramatic loss, no sudden consequence. Life continued, the routine stayed intact. Andrew was pleased. His family congratulated him. I was thanked for being supportive. Over time, I noticed I wasn't copied on certain conversations anymore. Meetings happened that I heard about afterward. Decisions were referenced as if I had been present when they were made. When I asked for clarification, Andrew explained patiently, like you would to someone who had simply missed a step. "You said you trusted me," he reminded me once, not unkindly. I did trust him. That was never the issue. The issue was that trust had become a one-way street. His family grew more comfortable speaking around me instead of to me. They discussed plans openly, using language that assumed agreement. When I expressed surprise, it was met with confusion, as if I had misunderstood my role rather than been excluded from it. "You're so flexible," one of them said with a smile. "That's a gift." Flexibility, I learned, was rewarded with invisibility. Andrew seemed to enjoy the ease of it all. The fewer questions I asked, the smoother things ran. He praised me for not being difficult, for not making situations emotional. I began to recognize that my silence wasn't just appreciated, it was expected. There was a small moment that crystallized it for me, though I didn't fully understand it then. I asked for access to information I had once handled myself. Andrew looked surprised, then gently suggested it wasn't necessary anymore. He said it would only confuse things, that he had it under control. I remember standing there, nodding, accepting the explanation, while something inside me tightened. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled, we'd rebalance, that this was just a phase of building, and that partnership would reassert itself naturally. But phases have a way of becoming permanent when no one challenges them. By the time I realized I was no longer being asked, only informed, the pattern had already formed. Silence led to approval. Approval led to exclusion. Exclusion led to decisions made without me. It wasn't betrayal yet, not in the way people imagine it. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no clear villain. Just a gradual narrowing of space, a quiet redistribution of power that no one thought to announce. I started paying closer attention then. Not because I planned to fight, but because something told me I should remember how we got here. Because whatever was coming next would not be accidental. And it would not be fair. The change didn't announce itself. It slipped in through routine, through small adjustments that were easy to excuse when you wanted things to stay peaceful. Andrew started coming home later. At first it was a meeting that ran long, a dinner he couldn't skip. Then it became a pattern. He would text instead of call, explanations growing shorter, less detailed. When I asked how his day went, he answered in summaries, not stories. He was present, technically, but his attention felt elsewhere, as if his real life was happening just out of my line of sight. I told myself it was pressure, growth, responsibility. Those were the words he used, and I repeated them like a mantra whenever doubt crept in. I didn't accuse, I didn't demand. I adjusted. The tone shifted too, subtly enough that I questioned whether I was imagining it. Conversations turned declarative. Andrew no longer asked what I thought. He informed me what he had decided. When I offered input, he listened politely, then proceeded as planned. "You trust me, right?" he would say, smiling. And I did. Or at least, I believed I should. The first time he mentioned her, it was casual. A name dropped in passing, attached to work. Nothing more. Someone who helped streamline things, someone efficient, someone who understood the pace he needed to keep. I didn't feel threatened. Why would I? There was nothing secretive about the way he spoke, nothing hushed or defensive. Her name came up often enough that it felt normal, familiar, too familiar in hindsight. I noticed I knew her schedule before I knew his. Family gatherings changed around the same time. Conversations would pause when I entered the room, then resume with careful neutrality. Decisions were referenced that I didn't remember discussing. Plans were already set by the time I heard about them. When I asked questions, they answered kindly but vaguely. When I expressed confusion, they exchanged looks that suggested concern, not guilt. "You seem tired," one of them said once. "This has been a lot for you." I wasn't tired. I was confused. But confusion, I was learning, was easily reframed as fragility. The first time I raised a real concern, Andrew responded with calm reassurance that felt oddly dismissive. He didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He simply explained why my perspective was off. "You're under a lot of stress," he said. "You're seeing problems that aren't really there." His family echoed the sentiment. They worried about me. They suggested I take a step back, let Andrew handle things until I felt more like myself again. The language was gentle, sympathetic. It was also effective. I started second-guessing my memory, my instincts. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I had misunderstood, if I had missed something obvious. The doubt was quiet but persistent, eroding my confidence one question at a time. They praised me often during this period, but always with conditions attached. "You're so calm about everything. You don't overreact like some people. You're not difficult." Each compliment carried an unspoken warning. Don't change, don't push, don't become a problem. I realized slowly that my reputation had become a tool. The version of me they admired was the version that didn't interfere. The moment I stepped outside that role, I was met with concern, with pity, with subtle correction. Outside support faded too. Friends I once spoke to regularly drifted out of my orbit, not through conflict, but through neglect. Invitations went unanswered. Calls were postponed. Andrew suggested it was better to keep things within the family for now, that outside opinions would only complicate matters. I agreed, because agreement was easier than fighting a battle I couldn't clearly define. There was a moment that changed something inside me, though I didn't act on it right away. I found out about a decision that affected me directly from someone else. It wasn't minor, it wasn't urgent, it was simply done. When I asked Andrew why I hadn't been included, he looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't think you'd mind," he said. "You usually don't." That sentence lingered with me long after the conversation ended. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. I usually didn't. And that, I realized, was the problem. I began to see how neatly everything fit together. The late nights, the new confidant, the family's sudden concern for my well-being, the way my questions were reframed as symptoms rather than signals. No one had raised their voice. No one had issued ultimatums. And yet, my world was shrinking. I didn't confront anyone then. I didn't accuse Andrew or question his loyalty. I didn't demand explanations or threaten consequences. Instead, I did something far less visible. I started paying attention. I noticed which conversations stopped when I entered the room. I noticed who spoke for me, and who never looked to me for confirmation. I noticed how easily my silence was interpreted as consent. Most importantly, I noticed how comfortable they had become assuming I would stay that way. By the end of that chapter of my life, I was no longer confused about what was happening. I simply hadn't named it yet. Control doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in concern, delivered by people who insist they know what's best for you. That was the moment I stopped waiting for clarity and started watching for patterns. Because something had shifted, and this time, I wasn't going to look away. The first time Andrew openly contradicted me, it happened in front of people who mattered, not strangers, not casual acquaintances, family, advisors, people whose opinions carried weight. We were seated around a long table, documents spread neatly between us. I had just finished explaining a concern, carefully, calmly, choosing my words the way I always did. Before I could finish the thought, Andrew spoke over me. "That's not really accurate," he said, smiling as if correcting a harmless mistake. "You're mixing up a few things." The room went quiet, not tense, just expectant. I stopped mid-sentence. Everyone looked at him, not me. He continued, reframing what I had said into something simpler, less precise, easier to dismiss. When he finished, one person nodded, another scribbled a note. No one asked me to clarify. Andrew didn't look at me then. He looked relieved, almost proud, like he'd just prevented an inconvenience. That was the moment I understood something fundamental had changed. Not because he disagreed with me, but because he didn't care how it made me look. After that, the language shifted quickly. I wasn't wrong anymore. I was overwhelmed. I wasn't cautious. I was sensitive. I wasn't asking questions. I was struggling. The words came softly, wrapped in concern. You've had a lot going on. This might be too much for you right now. Why don't you let us handle this? Someone suggested I step back for my own good. Another said it might help to reduce my stress. Andrew listened, nodding, never once defending me. He didn't have to. The story was forming on its own. It sounded rehearsed. A decision I should have been part of was finalized without me. I found out later, casually, like it wasn't worth mentioning sooner. When I asked why, Andrew sighed, the way people do when they think they're being patient. It was easier this way, he said. You've seemed stretched lately. Stretched. As if I were a fabric close to tearing. I wanted to argue. I wanted to list facts, timelines, contributions. Instead, I felt something colder settle in my chest. Recognition. This wasn't about what I knew or didn't know. This was about who they had decided I was. That was when she stopped being a name and started being a presence. The woman Andrew had mentioned so casually before appeared in spaces she had no reason to be in. She spoke confidently, offered opinions freely, was praised for her decisiveness. When she spoke, people listened. When I did, they watched Andrew for confirmation. She never looked uncomfortable, not once. She acted as if she belonged there, as if the transition was already complete and I was simply behind schedule. No one questioned it. Not out loud. I watched them compare us without saying so. Her calm was strength, mine was passivity. Her certainty was competence. My restraint was weakness. That night, alone in the bathroom, I stared at my reflection and didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not because she looked different, but because she looked uncertain. I searched my own face for signs of whatever they saw in me. Was I weak? The question landed harder than I expected. It lodged itself in my thoughts, replaying moments, twisting memories. Had I misjudged myself? Had I mistaken patience for strength? Had I given up ground without realizing it? I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront Andrew in a dramatic scene. Instead, I sat on the edge of the tub and breathed through the tightness in my chest until it loosened. That was my breaking point. Not because I shattered, but because something hardened. A friend reached out not long after, sensing the shift before I could articulate it. She asked if I was okay, really okay. I laughed it off, defended Andrew automatically, explained how busy things had been. I protected him. I protected the situation. Later, I would remember that conversation with a dull ache. Not because she was right, but because I had been so determined to prove everything was fine. The label followed me after that. Weak. Not spoken directly, but implied in every interaction. Andrew said it once, quietly, during a conversation that ended the last remaining illusion I had about us. You're not built for conflict, he told me. That's not a flaw, it's just who you are. He said it kindly, as if he were doing me a favor by naming it. His family accepted it immediately. No one objected, no one challenged the idea. It explained everything too neatly to question. They had decided who I was, and with that decision came justification. For excluding me, for replacing me, for planning a future where my voice didn't matter. I nodded. I let the moment pass. They thought the label would shrink me, that it would make me easier to manage, easier to move aside. They didn't understand that once something is named, it can also be examined. And I was done accepting definitions that benefited everyone but me. That was the last time I spoke freely about how I felt. The last time I assumed honesty would be met with fairness. From that point on, silence wasn't a response. It was a choice. They believed I was retreating. In reality, I was learning exactly how far they were willing to go once they believed I wouldn't stop them. I didn't uncover the truth by snooping or following anyone. It came to me quietly, the way real turning points often do, disguised as something ordinary. I was alone, handling a task Andrew had asked me to take care of because it was simple and didn't require much context. That phrasing should have warned me. While sorting through a shared digital folder, I noticed a file name that didn't match anything I recognized. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't protected. It was just there, overlooked because no one thought I would understand it. I opened it without thinking. At first, nothing made sense. Dates that didn't align with conversations I remembered. Language that felt oddly familiar, like echoes of things Andrew and his family had said aloud. Names repeated in patterns that felt deliberate. I closed the file, reopened it, then opened another, and another. That was when the shape of it began to emerge. This wasn't chaos, it was design. I started cross-checking, carefully, methodically. I matched timelines to moments when my questions had been dismissed. I noticed how the narrative about me shifted right after certain documents were finalized. How concern for my well-being intensified precisely when authority was transferred out of my reach. The realization didn't hurt the way betrayal usually does. There was no sharp pain, no sudden collapse of emotion. What I felt instead was cold clarity, a tightening focus, like a lens snapping into place. The affair, which I had suspected but never confirmed, suddenly moved to the background. It was real, I had no doubt of that now, but it wasn't the center of what was happening. It was useful, a distraction, something obvious enough to draw attention while more permanent decisions were made quietly. I understood then why she was visible, why her presence wasn't hidden or denied. It gave everyone something simpler to point at, something emotional, something people understood. While they watched the surface, the foundation was being altered. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction from the past months rearranged itself in my memory, lining up with this new understanding. The way Andrew spoke about protection, the family's rehearsed concern, the timing of my exclusion. This wasn't about love fading or attraction shifting. It wasn't about another woman stepping into my place. It was about control. The most unsettling part was realizing how many people had to be aware of it for the plan to work. No single villain, no dramatic mastermind. Just a network of aligned interests, each person playing their role, benefiting from my perceived passivity. Silence, I saw now, had protected them, not me. I sat back in my chair and let the information settle. Panic would have been understandable. Rage would have been justified. But neither would help me. This wasn't something I could argue my way out of or expose prematurely. It was bigger than one confrontation. For the first time since everything began to unravel, I stopped thinking in terms of fairness. Fairness assumed shared values. Fairness assumed good faith. This situation had neither. I began to consider what doing nothing would cost me. Not just materially, though that mattered, but legally, socially, personally. The version of myself they were constructing didn't just make me easier to sideline. It made me unreliable. It made my voice questionable by default. If I let that stand, there would be no undoing it later. That was the moment the story stopped being about saving a marriage or reclaiming respect. It became about survival. About retaining the right to define myself in a system that was already writing my character for me. I didn't confront Andrew. I didn't mention what I had found. I didn't change my behavior in any visible way. Instead, I did something far more difficult. I accepted that fairness wasn't coming. That acceptance freed me. I stopped hoping for honesty. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. I stopped believing that if I explained myself clearly enough, someone would listen. From that point on, I treated every interaction as information. I began documenting quietly, not obsessively, not dramatically. I noted dates, language, who said what and when. I paid attention to repetition, to patterns that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Silence became a tool instead of a shield. The less I reacted, the more people assumed I was unaware. Conversations grew looser, assumptions were spoken out loud. Things I wasn't meant to know drifted into my reach because no one thought I could use them. I understood then why they had needed me to be weak. Underestimation wasn't an accident. It was essential. One night, lying awake beside Andrew, I stared at the ceiling and felt something close to relief. Not because the truth was kind, but because it was clear. Clarity has a way of steadying you. It removes the exhausting work of guessing. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be resolved. It was a takeover, and I was done playing the role of the confused spouse. From that point forward, I didn't seek reassurance or validation. I sought understanding. I didn't ask permission. I gathered leverage. I didn't speak unless it served a purpose. They believed my quiet meant surrender, that I had accepted their version of who I was. In reality, I had finally understood the game they were playing. And once you understand the rules, you don't need to shout to change the outcome. I didn't speak up impulsively. By the time I decided to say something, I had rehearsed it in my head dozens of times, trimming away anything that sounded emotional, anything that could be used against me. I told myself that a calm conversation grounded in facts might reset things, that if I showed I was paying attention, Andrew would recalibrate. I chose a neutral moment, not an argument, not a crisis, just a quiet evening when the house felt still enough to hold a serious conversation without witnesses. I have some questions, I said, keeping my voice even, about the decisions that have been made recently. Andrew didn't look surprised. That should have been my first warning. He listened at first, arms crossed loosely, head tilted like he was indulging a thought experiment. I asked about timelines, about authority, about why certain choices had moved forward without my involvement. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I left space for reasonable explanations. When I finished, he smiled. Not warmly, not reassuringly, amused. I was wondering when this would come up, he said. You've been acting different. The word landed heavier than it should have. Different how? I wanted to ask, but I waited. He leaned back, folding his hands behind his head, suddenly relaxed in a way that felt calculated. You're connecting dots that don't really belong together, he said. That's usually a sign you're overwhelmed. I felt the shift immediately. The conversation wasn't happening on equal ground anymore. I'm not overwhelmed, I said. I'm asking about specific things. He waved the sentence away with a small gesture. That's exactly what I mean. Then his tone changed, not louder, colder. You need to be careful, he said. This kind of thinking can backfire. I asked him what he meant, though I already sensed the answer. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. He referenced people, advisors, processes. He reminded me that certain decisions were already in motion, that pushing against them now would only complicate matters. For you, he added. The implication was clear. Resistance wouldn't hurt him. It would hurt me. I recognized the posture instantly. This wasn't a husband trying to reassure his wife. This was someone asserting authority, confident he had the leverage to do so. He spoke as if outcomes were already determined, as if my role was simply to accept them gracefully. I realized then that this wasn't the first time this conversation had been imagined. It had been prepared for. My questions weren't unexpected. They were anticipated. His family reinforced it within days. Concern replaced curiosity. Worry replaced dialogue. They called to check on me, not to ask what I needed, but to suggest I slow down, rest, take care of myself. One of them gently implied that stress could distort perception. Another suggested it might be best if Andrew handled things until I felt more like myself again. It was coordinated. I could hear it in the repetition, the same phrases surfacing from different mouths, the same framing delivered with practiced sympathy. I understood then how the system worked. Andrew didn't need to silence me directly. He had built a network that would do it for him, cloaked in concern and plausible deniability. The other woman's role became clearer after that. She didn't confront me. She didn't taunt or threaten. She simply existed, visible and confident, a living example of what cooperation looked like. She was praised for her clarity, her decisiveness, her lack of complications. She was rewarded for obedience. The consequences of my brief attempt at honesty were immediate and unmistakable. Access disappeared. Information stopped flowing. Decisions were made faster, with less explanation. When I asked about something I used to be involved in, Andrew told me it was temporary, that it was for my own good. The punishment wasn't loud. It was efficient. That night, I sat alone in the dark living room and let myself acknowledge what I had avoided admitting before. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't stress or miscommunication or growing pains. It was a warning. I replayed the conversation in my mind, not with regret, but with clarity. I saw how carefully he had chosen his words, how easily he had shifted the ground beneath me, how quickly concern had turned into control. That was the last time I confronted him without leverage. I made a rule for myself then, one that would shape everything that followed. I would never ask a question unless I already knew the answer. I would never challenge a decision unless I understood exactly what it would cost me. I would never speak from a position of vulnerability again. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped correcting assumptions. I stopped offering opinions unless they were requested. Outwardly, it looked like retreat, like acceptance, like defeat. Andrew relaxed almost immediately. He mistook my quiet for surrender, the way people always do when they believe power is secure. His guard lowered, his confidence sharpened. That was the mistake. I began taking inventory, not on paper, not anywhere visible, in my head. I noted names, dates, shifts in language. I paid attention to who spoke freely around me and who avoided me entirely. I listened more than I ever had before. Silence gave me access I hadn't realized I'd lost. The last thing I said openly, before fully committing to this new way of moving through my own life, was something small and unremarkable. Andrew didn't even remember it later. That was fitting. From that point on, every word I didn't say was a decision. Every reaction I withheld was information. Every assumption they made about me worked in my favor. They believed they had put me back in my place. In reality, they had just shown me exactly where all the pressure points were, and I was done pretending not to notice. After that conversation, I became exactly what they wanted me to be: quiet, agreeable, uncomplicated. I stopped asking questions and started smiling at the right moments. I nodded when decisions were announced. I thanked people for thinking of me. From the outside, it looked like I had finally accepted my place. Andrew relaxed almost immediately. His shoulders loosened. His voice softened. He stopped watching my reactions as closely. The family followed his lead, their concern easing into relief. Conversations resumed in my presence without the careful pauses they'd adopted before. They thought the tension had passed. That was when the guard came down. The ally I didn't know I needed entered my life through something mundane, an appointment I couldn't avoid. A routine obligation Andrew had delegated to me because it was, in his words, administrative. I didn't go looking for help. I wasn't brave enough for that yet. I was still surviving. She noticed me first, not in the way people usually do, with curiosity or pity, but with recognition. She spoke to me like someone who assumed I understood what was happening, not someone who needed things simplified. That alone caught my attention. We exchanged pleasantries. Nothing revealing, nothing personal. Then she said something small, almost careless, referencing a detail I hadn't mentioned to anyone. I froze. She noticed that too. "I didn't mean to surprise you," she said calmly. "I just assumed you were aware." Aware of what, exactly, hung between us, unspoken. I didn't respond right away. I asked a neutral question instead. Something that could be brushed off as coincidence if I needed to retreat. She answered it with precision. Dates, context, a connection I could verify on my own. That was when I understood this wasn't luck. She wasn't central to anything. She didn't hold power in the way Andrew did. She existed adjacent to it, overlooked because she wasn't loud or impressive. People like that are dangerous in systems built on arrogance. "You're not who they think you are," she said quietly, not as an opinion but as an observation. I didn't confirm or deny it. I didn't need to. The truth of it sat between us, solid and undeniable. We spoke carefully after that, not as confidants, not as conspirators, as professionals testing the weight of each other's words. I revealed nothing sensitive. She offered one fact I could confirm without risk. When I did, my pulse steadied for the first time in weeks. This was the first honest exchange I'd had in months. She didn't promise to save me. She didn't offer grand solutions. What she did offer was perspective. She explained without judgment how perception shapes access, how people speak freely around those they underestimate, how silence creates space others rush to fill. "They think your quiet means you don't understand," she said. "That's why they talk." She wasn't telling me anything I hadn't already begun to sense, but hearing it, articulated, reframed everything. My so-called weakness hadn't just made me manageable, it had made me invisible. Invisible people hear everything. She warned me not to rush, not to confront, not to change my behavior in ways that would draw attention. One wrong move, she said, and the window would close. "Document what comes to you," she advised. "Don't reach for what doesn't." I agreed without hesitation. My first strategic move was almost laughably small. I saved something that had been left open. I remembered a phrase repeated in 2 different conversations days apart. I noticed who relaxed when I entered the room and who stiffened. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just attention. The risk, she reminded me, wasn't in knowing. It was in letting them know I knew. Living that way was exhausting. Every interaction required restraint. Every reaction had to be calibrated. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to confront, to rip the curtain down and force acknowledgement. I didn't. Discipline mattered more than relief. The family grew more careless as weeks passed. Plans were discussed openly, assumptions were stated as facts. Andrew laughed more. He stopped checking his tone around me. He believed the problem had resolved itself. I became part of the background, which meant I heard things I wasn't meant to. I learned how decisions were framed after the fact. I learned which phrases signaled coordination. I learned who was motivated by loyalty and who was motivated by fear. I learned who benefited most from my silence. And then quietly, I learned where the lines were, the ones they would never expect me to see, let alone understand. The ally cautioned me again. "Don't confuse access with safety," she said. "You're closer now. That makes mistakes more dangerous." I took that seriously. I didn't trust her blindly. I verified everything. I assumed nothing. Trust, I had learned, was not a feeling. It was a calculation. By the time I realized how much information I had accumulated, the shape of the board was clear. The players, the incentives, the pressure points. They were all there, laid out by people who believed I wasn't paying attention. One evening, I watched Andrew and his family laugh together, relaxed and confident, their future unfolding exactly as planned. They didn't look at me. They didn't need to. I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just clarity. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits. It listens. It lets others talk themselves into mistakes. They thought the fight was over. In truth, it hadn't started yet. And for the first time, I knew exactly when it would. From the outside, nothing about me changed. That was the point. I kept my voice light, my questions minimal, my presence easy to ignore. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have thought I was healing, adjusting, letting go of whatever tension had once existed. Inside, I was living a double life. Every conversation became data. Every pause, every repeated phrase, every assumption spoken out loud was noted and filed away in my memory. I learned to listen without reacting, to nod without agreeing, to appear disengaged while absorbing everything. Andrew grew careless quickly. Confidence does that to people. He stopped lowering his voice when discussing plans around me. He assumed I didn't understand the terminology, the timelines, the implications. He spoke freely, especially when he wanted to show off his control. His family followed suit. They talked around me, not to me, as if I were furniture. Decisions were justified out loud, as though narrating their logic made it untouchable. I learned more in those moments than I ever had when I was being included. I didn't collect single explosive revelations. I collected patterns, dates that aligned too neatly, language that repeated across different people, word for word. Decisions framed as spontaneous that followed the same sequence every time. On their own, each detail meant nothing. Together they told a story no one realized they were telling. The hardest part was discipline. There were moments when I wanted to react, when something so blatantly unfair was said that my instinct screamed to correct it. Each time I reminded myself of the rule I had set. No reaction without leverage, no confrontation without consequence. Silence was exhausting, but it was working. Then I discovered the betrayal I hadn't anticipated. It came from someone I had trusted, not deeply, but comfortably, someone who existed on the edges of everything, close enough to hear, close enough to matter. I noticed a shift in how information moved, a slight delay, a phrase repeated back to me that I had only spoken once, privately. It didn't take long to confirm. They were feeding information, not out of malice, out of fear. Self-preservation has a way of making people justify almost anything. They were telling Andrew what they thought he needed to know, trimming the truth to keep themselves safe. For a brief moment, the discovery knocked the air out of me. Betrayal always does, no matter how prepared you think you are. I allowed myself that moment alone, sitting in the quiet, feeling the familiar ache of disappointment. Then I adjusted. If information was flowing through them anyway, I could redirect it. I softened around them. I became vulnerable in small, calculated ways. I let them believe I was confused, unsure, afraid of what was coming. I asked questions I already knew the answers to, framing them as worries instead of investigations. They responded exactly as I expected. More details surfaced, more reassurance, more careless honesty, spoken in the tone people use when they believe they are guiding someone weaker. The risk increased after that. Andrew accelerated timelines. Deadlines appeared where there had been none before. Decisions were rushed, framed as necessary, inevitable. Pressure wrapped itself in concern. "This will all be easier if you just let it happen," he told me once, his voice calm, almost kind. I nodded. I thanked him. I let him believe I was overwhelmed. Behind the scenes, the ally warned me the window was closing. Whatever was going to happen would happen soon. The hearing date loomed, no longer abstract, no longer distant. Instead of fear, I felt focus. I began organizing what I had gathered, not physically yet, but mentally, grouping information into sequences that made sense: cause and effect, action and consequence, pattern and proof. The story they thought they controlled was already written. They just didn't know it. Andrew and his family celebrated prematurely. I heard it in their laughter, in the relaxed way they talked about the future. They spoke as if the outcome was guaranteed, as if I were already gone from the picture. They didn't hide it anymore. One evening, I listened as plans were discussed openly, my absence from them assumed, not debated. I watched Andrew smile, confident and unburdened, secure in the belief that I was finished. I felt no urge to interrupt. By then, I understood something fundamental. Power doesn't panic. It rushes when it thinks it has won. The trap wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was simply set, piece by people who underestimated the one person paying attention. As the hearing approached, I slept better than I had in months. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I knew exactly where I stood. There is a strange peace that comes with clarity, even when the outcome is uncertain. They thought the hearing would end me, that it would confirm everything they believed about me, that it would formalize their version of the truth. What they didn't realize was that the hearing wasn't the danger. It was the reveal. And when the time came, I would still be silent. Not because I had nothing to say, but because everything that mattered was already waiting to speak for me. The bailiff's voice cut through the low murmur of the room, sharp and practiced, pulling everyone to their feet. Chairs scraped back in uneven rhythm as the judge entered and took his seat. The sound echoed, final and undeniable, grounding us in the present. I felt it then, the full weight of where I was. Not the fear I had expected months ago, but a strange steadiness, like standing on solid ground after a long crossing. This was the moment everything had been circling, and I was ready for it. Andrew didn't look at me as we sat. He didn't need to. His confidence filled the space between us, easy and unguarded. He leaned slightly toward his attorney, whispering something that made them both smile. It wasn't nervous energy. It was certainty. From the corner of my eye, I saw his mistress seated just behind him, posture perfect, expression composed. She looked like someone attending a formality, not a reckoning. His family sat together in a tight row, unified, prepared to be seen as exactly what they wanted the court to believe they were: concerned, reasonable, protective. I sat quietly at my table, hands folded, eyes forward. I didn't fidget. I didn't scan the room. I didn't look at Andrew or at anyone who had once claimed to worry about me. Everything I needed was already in place. As the proceedings began, Andrew's attorney stood first. His voice was smooth, confident, practiced in the art of sounding authoritative without sounding aggressive. He painted a picture with care, one designed to feel obvious, almost boring in its simplicity. I was described as overwhelmed, well-meaning, but not equipped to handle complexity. Someone who had been shielded out of necessity, not malice. Andrew, in contrast, was framed as patient, responsible, carrying the weight of difficult decisions to spare me stress. The language was familiar. I had heard versions of it in living rooms and phone calls, at family gatherings and private conversations. Hearing it repeated in a courtroom didn't shock me. It confirmed what I already knew. As the attorney spoke, Andrew leaned back in his chair, arms relaxed, ankle resting over his knee. He glanced around the room once, taking in the faces, then settled comfortably. He looked like a man watching a formality unfold, not someone defending his future. No one looked at me. That was part of the story they were telling, that I didn't matter enough to watch. I didn't interrupt. I didn't object. I didn't react when assumptions were stated as facts, or when my silence was framed as evidence of fragility. From the outside, it must have looked like I was shrinking further into myself. In reality, I was listening. I watched the judge as closely as I had watched Andrew over the past months. The pauses, the note-taking, the slight narrowing of his eyes when certain claims were made too confidently. He asked a few clarifying questions, neutral in tone, precise in wording. Andrew's attorney answered smoothly, perhaps a little too quickly. The atmosphere shifted in ways most people missed. Andrew didn't. I saw the flicker of irritation cross his face when the judge asked for clarification on a point that had been presented as settled. He leaned forward then, attentive again, adjusting his posture as if recalibrating. His mistress remained still, eyes forward, hands folded. His family sat upright, their expressions careful now, less relaxed than before. Confidence has a way of thinning when it meets scrutiny. When it was my attorney's turn to speak, I remained silent. I didn't look at him for reassurance. I didn't brace myself. This wasn't my performance. It never had been. As the arguments continued, I could feel the room's perception of me hardening into something fixed and narrow. They thought they knew who I was. They thought they understood my role. They mistook my restraint for absence. The judge listened. He took notes. He didn't interrupt unnecessarily. And slowly, subtly, the rhythm of the room changed. The attorney's certainty began to sound rehearsed. Explanations grew longer. Justifications stacked on top of one another. The clean narrative started to fray at the edges. Andrew shifted again, his confidence tightening into something more brittle. He glanced back once, catching his family's eyes, then looked forward quickly, as if reminding himself this was under control. I felt no satisfaction watching it, no thrill, only confirmation. This was the last stretch of the illusion, the final moments before belief gave way to fact. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers resting on the edge of the file. He looked at the papers, then at the attorneys, then out across the room. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, expectant. Andrew glanced at me then. Just once. It wasn't hostile or angry, it was curious, as if he were finally noticing something didn't quite add up. I met his gaze without changing my expression. Whatever he was searching for in my face, he didn't find it. The judge closed the file with a soft, deliberate motion. The sound landed like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. He adjusted his glasses, eyes scanning the room one last time before settling forward. This was it. This was the last second Andrew believed the story he had told would hold. The last second his family thought concern would outweigh coordination. The last second anyone in that room mistook my silence for weakness. When the judge finally spoke, it would not be to confirm what they expected. It would be to dismantle it. And I sat there, calm and steady, knowing that everything I had endured, every word I had swallowed, every reaction I had withheld, had led to this exact moment. I didn't need to speak. The truth was about to do it for me. The judge did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, the room adjusted itself around his words, like everything else had been waiting for them. He didn't begin by addressing Andrew. That alone was enough to change the temperature in the courtroom. Instead, he looked down at the file again, tapped it once with his pen, and said he wanted to clarify a few points before moving forward. His tone was calm, almost conversational, but the effect was immediate. The confident rhythm Andrew's attorney had relied on faltered, just slightly. The judge spoke about facts, not feelings, dates, sequences, authority. He referenced specific moments when decisions had been made, noting how responsibility had shifted at key intervals. He didn't accuse. He observed. And with each observation, the story Andrew's side had presented grew thinner. He paused, then said something that landed harder than any accusation could have. "Silence," he said, "is not evidence of incapacity." I felt the shift ripple through the room. He continued, explaining that restraint is often mistaken for compliance, especially when others benefit from that assumption. He noted that assumptions about competence, particularly when based on demeanor rather than record, were unreliable at best. Andrew's attorney tried to interject, but the judge held up a hand. Not sharply, not rudely, just enough. The judge began outlining patterns. Language repeated across different statements. Decisions justified using identical phrasing. Actions framed as spontaneous that followed the same sequence every time. He didn't call it coordination outright. He didn't have to. He simply asked whether the court was meant to believe all of this was coincidence. Andrew sat forward now, his earlier ease gone. His jaw tightened. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked uncertain. The judge turned his attention to Andrew directly then. He asked measured questions about authority and timing, about when certain responsibilities had been reassigned and under what circumstances. Andrew answered, but the confidence in his voice wavered. Each response seemed to require more explanation than the last. Behind him, his family shifted. Someone leaned in to whisper, then stopped, realizing there was nothing left to add. His mistress stared straight ahead, her posture unchanged but her expression frozen, as if she were waiting for instructions that weren't coming. The judge returned to the file. He acknowledged my role next, not emotionally, not sympathetically, formally. He referenced my involvement in decisions early on, my documented participation, the consistency of my restraint once my authority was diminished. He spoke of contribution and entitlement in the same breath, placing them exactly where they belonged. I didn't move, I didn't nod, I didn't react. But something inside me loosened. For months, my silence had been framed as weakness. Now it was being recognized as credibility. The judge announced immediate orders, temporary but firm. Oversight where there had been none, restrictions where control had been assumed. He emphasized accountability, not punishment, and made it clear that the court would not tolerate narratives designed to sideline one party under the guise of protection. Andrew's control evaporated in real time. He opened his mouth once as if to say something, then closed it again. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but the urgency sounded hollow now. The foundation they had built their confidence on had collapsed. The judge never acknowledged the spectacle of the affair. He didn't comment on it beyond what was legally necessary. He reduced it to irrelevance with a few precise sentences, stripping it of the power it had held in private. Drama, I realized, only matters when it distracts from truth. Once the truth is centered, the rest falls away. The judge concluded by setting next steps, his voice steady, decisive. He closed the file again, this time with finality, and announced a pause in proceedings. The gavel didn't slam. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Andrew stared ahead, his face unreadable now, stripped of its earlier certainty. His family avoided one another's eyes. The unity they had relied on fractured without ceremony. I stood when instructed, smoothing my jacket, my movements calm and deliberate. I didn't look at Andrew as I rose. I didn't need to. The judge's last words before recess weren't dramatic. They were simple, direct. Assumptions, he said, are not evidence. That was it. As we left the courtroom, people moved around me carefully, as if unsure how to approach. Andrew lingered behind, speaking in hushed tones to his attorney, his voice tight with something that sounded like disbelief. Outside, the hallway felt brighter, louder, ordinary. The world hadn't changed, but my position in it had. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt validated. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't being spoken for, spoken over, or spoken about. I had been recognized not because I demanded it, but because I endured long enough for the truth to surface. They had built their strategy on the belief that I would break under pressure. Instead, I had waited. And in that waiting, everything they relied on had come undone. The courtroom emptied slowly, like a room exhaling after holding its breath for too long. People gathered their papers, whispered to one another, avoided eye contact. Chairs scraped back. The tension didn't vanish all at once. It loosened in pieces. Andrew stood frozen for a moment, as if he were waiting for someone to tell him what to do next. No one did. His attorney spoke in low, urgent tones, but the words didn't seem to land. The confidence he'd worn so easily that morning had slipped away, leaving something smaller and uncertain behind. His family fractured almost immediately. They no longer moved as a unit. One of them walked ahead without looking back. Another lagged behind, eyes down, phone already in hand. Whatever story they had rehearsed together had ended inside that courtroom. I walked out without rushing. My legs felt steady beneath me, my breath even. There was no surge of victory, no dramatic release. Just a quiet sense of balance returning to a place that had been tilted for far too long. In the hallway, the noise of the building rushed back in. Footsteps, voices, the ordinary rhythm of a place where lives intersect briefly and then move on. It struck me how quickly the world absorbs moments that feel monumental when you're inside them. I found a quiet corner near a window and stood there for a minute, letting the light fall across my hands. They weren't shaking. That surprised me. I had imagined this moment so many times, always assuming I would feel something bigger. What I felt instead was clarity. This had never been about winning. It wasn't about humiliation or revenge in the way people imagine it. It was about being seen accurately, about having the truth placed where it belonged, without distortion or decoration. The days that followed unfolded without spectacle. The legal consequences took shape methodically. Oversight replaced unchecked control. Boundaries were drawn where assumptions had once lived. Accountability settled in, quiet but firm. Andrew didn't reach out to me, not to argue, not to explain, not to apologize. In a strange way, that felt fitting. There was nothing left to negotiate. The system he had relied on no longer worked in his favor. His mistress disappeared from relevance just as quietly as she had appeared. No confrontation, no closure scene, just absence. Once the power she had been attached to evaporated, so did her presence. I returned to my life slowly, deliberately. I reclaimed routines that had been disrupted. I took control of decisions that were mine to make. I spoke when I needed to, and stayed silent when it served me. For the first time in a long while, silence felt like peace instead of pressure. One evening, weeks later, I stood in my kitchen and sorted through a stack of documents, placing them neatly into folders where they belonged. The act was mundane, almost boring, and yet it felt like a declaration. This space was mine again. This life was mine again. I thought about how often I had been called weak, how easily that word had been used to explain away my restraint, my patience, my refusal to perform emotion for an audience. I thought about how convenient that label had been for people who benefited from my quiet. Strength, I realized, isn't loud. It doesn't rush. It doesn't always demand immediate acknowledgement. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it prepares, sometimes it survives long enough to be undeniable. If you've ever been underestimated because you chose not to shout, if your silence has been mistaken for surrender, you're not alone. I know how it feels to be spoken for, to be reduced, to be dismissed because you didn't fit someone else's idea of power. I also know this. Being quiet doesn't mean being empty. Being patient doesn't mean being powerless. And being underestimated can become an advantage when you learn how to use it. If parts of my story felt familiar, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment when people assumed you were weak, only to realize later how wrong they were? Share your experience in the comments. These stories matter more than we're ever taught to believe. And if you want to hear more real stories like this, stories where truth outlasts arrogance and quiet strength has its moment, stay here with me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg to be understood. I didn't need to. I waited. And when the truth finally spoke, it said everything I never had to.